It's good to see you guys. My name is Brandon, if we haven't had the pleasure to meet yet. And as Matt was saying, I am the student pastor here at Bridge Church. So it's good to be hanging out with you guys. Typically, we're upstairs hanging out with some middle school and high school, my people. That's my people. And there's this guy on the internet. His name's Cool Carl. And we've watched some of his videos here. But if you haven't watched any of his videos, he just put a video on YouTube a couple weeks back that it kind of explained, it taught youth pastors how to kind of like spruce up their description of what they do around here. So some would say that I teach a weekly vintage literature class to students, okay? For all my office fans in the building, you could say I'm assistant to the spiritual manager. You know what I'm saying? If you're following. But anyway, have a good time hanging out with your students, and so glad to be here. And yeah, I'm excited. But hey, there's this word that we use a lot around this church. And whether it's your 500th time being here or if it's your first time being here, there's this what am I trying to say? This key word that we focus in on a lot around here, and that's belonging. That's belonging. And belonging is so much more than a word to us, but in fact, it kind of fuels everything that we do. What we believe, who we are becoming as a church, we profoundly believe in this idea that it starts with belonging, knowing that you belong exactly the way that you are, right? And there's an order to that, right? Because before we can ever belong to each other as a church community, we first have to belong to God. And we have to allow that truth and that reality and that love that says that you are enough just the way that you are to fuel who we are as a person, right? And we've kind of identified some gaps that all of us as a community of people, as a culture, there's these gaps that pretty much all of us have wrestled with or struggled with at some point in time in our life. And one of those is, who are we? Who are we as people? What is our identity? And we profoundly believe that identity, the truth in that identity is found, and it starts from belonging to God. And knowing that you are enough. And knowing that His love never changes based upon anything that you do. But this profound sense that He loves us with a perfect love. And so this morning, what I kind of want to talk about is this reality that, I don't have the whole identity thing figured out yet, but I am realizing the importance of it. And there's days where I feel like I have a good grasp of who I am in Christ. And then there's other days where I'm just kind of like, bro, I don't know. I thought I knew who I was, but I don't know who I am anymore. You ever been there? And but I'm starting to realize this really, really cool correlation. And I don't have it perfected yet, but I kind of want to share this correlation that I'm beginning to realize. It's this thing that speaks into and helps us to experience the fullness of who Jesus is and belonging to Him. Because whether we realize it or not, who we are fuels what we do. And it's so crucial that we have this idea of who we are, okay? And this correlation, it was kind of brought back to my memory a couple weekends ago. If you don't know, one of the cool things that we get to do in the Bridge students every year is go to Kings Island. Do I have any Kings Island fans in the house? Do I have any roller coaster enthusiasts in the house? Okay, there's my people. Well, I was riding this ride, or getting ready to ride this ride at Kings Island, right? And it's called the Banshee. And if you've never ridden this ride before, you are in luck, because we're going to ride it together this morning. Are you ready? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to throw this video up on the screen. And as we're going up this first drop, let me get out of the way. There's a certain part of this roller coaster, and I'm going to point it out to you, that every time I get on the Banshee, this part sticks out. Get ready. Hands up, everybody. Hands up. Here we go. So you go down the first drop. That's 150 feet to be exact. You go into an inverted loop that takes you around. You go through loop number 2. Who's feeling it? Come on. We go around. And this is the part coming up. I want to point it out to you. Here we go. We're going down. We're coming up towards the end. And this is it right here. You ready? All right. A little bit longer. Sorry. I thought I had it. Listen, this happens so fast that you don't even realize like what's happening when it's happening, okay? I think it's right here. Here we go. But this is the part that sticks out on this roller coaster every single time. And when you go, right here. Oh gosh. Right there. That part right there. And let me explain why this part is like the defining moment in the ride of the Banshee. When you get to that part, you will undeniably experience the fullness of what the Banshee has to offer. And there's a reason for that. During that one part of the ride, something different happens that doesn't happen on any other part of the ride. Because again, like, you just came out of a 167-foot tall drop, 2 vertical loops, what they call a dive loop. You experience 0G in a loop, a pretzel knot, and an incline twist before you get to that part. And the one thing that is different about that part that kind of gets you in the fullness of what the Banshee has to offer that none of the other parts do, the ride very purposefully and intentionally slows down. And so the people that are controlling the buttons of this ride, I don't know if they have control over the speed, but every time when you get to that corkscrew spot, you're going so fast, but they'll purposely slow it down, and you can feel all that corkscrew has to offer. And there is an undeniable moment that lets you know that you're upside down, okay? And you feel yourself coming out of your seat. And I was thinking about that the other day, and I was thinking about the correlation between purposefully and intentionally slowing down that allows you to experience the fullness of a moment. And kind of this correlation that I'm beginning to realize in and of my own life and belonging to God fully is that there is this very, very direct correlation between slowing down the pace at which you're going that helps you to experience the fullness of who God is and the truth of His love. That then speaks to and answers the question of who am I? Who am I? Right? And there's a story in the Bible that kind of reiterates or reinforces this idea, and it's found in Luke chapter 10. And if you have your Bibles, you can turn there, if your devices or whatever. I think we're going to throw it up on the screen, so even if you don't have that, we got you. But in this passage, Jesus is kind of in the height of His ministry, and He's teaching all of these different people, and He's traveling to and fro, and He finds Himself at a point of His journey where He's going into a woman's house where there's a woman and her sister who is preparing the house for Jesus, okay? So it's in Luke 10, and we're going to read a few verses. It says this. It says, as Jesus and the disciples continued on their journey, they came to a village where there was a woman who welcomed Jesus into her home. And her name was Martha. And she had a sister named Mary. Mary sat down attentively before the Master, or Jesus, absorbing every revelation that He shared. But Martha became exasperated, or one translation says distracted, with finishing the numerous household chores in preparation for her guest. And so she interrupted Jesus and said, Lord, don't you think it's unfair that my sister left me to do all the work by myself? You should tell her to get up and help me. Sassy. The Lord answered her, Martha, my beloved Martha, why are you upset and troubled, pulled away by all these many distractions? Mary has discovered the one thing most important by choosing to sit at my feet. She is undistracted, and I won't take this privilege from her. So in this story, I kind of want to pull just 4 quick observations that would speak to this idea that there is a correlation between the pace in which we live life and intentionally slowing down just to belong to God, which then fuels and it answers the question of who am I, which is a gap, again, that we all sometimes deal with. And I want to start in verse 40. If we go back to that, in verse 40, I want to point something out to you. It says, Martha became distracted with finishing the numerous household chores in preparation for her guest. So she interrupted Jesus and said, Lord, don't you think it's unfair that I got to do all the work by myself? Like, get this girl on the right track and help me to get this stuff done. But I think it's cool because what's interesting about this is Martha had become distracted from belonging to God, a moment that presented itself as an opportunity to fully belong to God because she was trying to get the chores done and make it presentable for her guests. Like, that's not such a terrible thing to do, right? She was taking the time. She was seeing value in that moment, and she was trying her best to present like this tidy house, or she was presenting this she was doing her best to make her house look nice so that her guests would feel welcome there. And that's not a terrible thing to do, I don't feel like, right? Like, she had good intentions in that moment. But I started thinking about that, and I'm like, man, sometimes my good intentions, they get away from me. And my good intentions to make a moment the best moment that I can. See, what happens is when my good intentions gets away from me, it almost becomes this temptation to perform. And what happens is when moments get away from us and our good intentions get away from us, there's this pressure to perform. And the thing about a performative way of living is that there's this consistent side effect that says more, 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 more. Because once you perform, you don't only have to perform, but you have to keep performing, right? And so what happens is it turns into this thing where our good intentions get away from us, and then there's this temptation to perform for the people around us, because culture provides so many opportunities that says if you perform well, that will speak to your identity, and that will make you enough, or that will make you valuable. And so what happens is, again, in the rush that a performative way of living presents, we lose sight of a beautiful moment to sit at Jesus' feet at dinner with people that matter most, right? But what I thought was really, really, really cool was Jesus' response to Martha in allowing her good intentions to get away from her. And this is probably my favorite part of this whole passage. It's in verse 41. I'm going to read it one more time. So Martha, again, in her best effort, is trying to tidy up the house. It's kind of gotten away from her. It turns into this moment where she feels like she's only going to be identified by how her house looks. And then it says in verse 41, the Lord answered her and said, Martha, what's it say? My beloved Martha, why are you upset and troubled, pulled away by all these distractions? And so this was super encouraging to me, because if you're like me, I know that I've allowed my life to sometimes get away from me, my good intentions to get away from me. And in those moments, I'll kind of attach my identity to the fact or the reality that I've allowed that moment to get away from me and turn into something that I never intended it to turn into, which was a performance. And sometimes, if you're like me, I will think in my head that Jesus' view of me has changed because I've allowed a moment with him to get away from me. And in reality, if we look in this passage in verse 41, Jesus' response to Martha, allowing her good intentions to get away from her, never changed. In fact, it was right in the middle of her allowing this moment to get away from her that Jesus says, Martha, my beloved Martha. Still calls her beloved in a moment that she felt rushed and it got away from her. And I don't know about you, but it's super encouraging to me to know that this story isn't about separating good from bad. This story isn't about, you've allowed this moment, you've allowed this to get away from you. The pressure from culture to perform has made you to rush and more and more and more and more, and you've missed the moment to belong to God. God doesn't suddenly call you bad. This isn't about good and bad, right? But rather, in the moment that Martha found herself, I would dare say, rushed, stressed, angry, 100%. She's salty at her sister. Jesus still chose to identify her as beloved. And that's super, super encouraging to me, is that your belonging or your identity in Christ isn't based upon your effort or lack thereof. And so we go on. In verse 42, I want to talk about something that was really, really cool. So he talks to Martha and says, Martha, why are you so salty? Why are you so troubled? Like, Mary has discovered the one thing that is most important by doing what? Choosing to sit at my feet. She is undistracted. And then it goes on. But in verse 42, I want to point something out. Jesus comes to the house, and Mary immediately sits at Jesus' feet. There wasn't this moment where Mary went away to like spruce herself up. There wasn't a moment where like Mary's like, hold on, Jesus, let me go clean up real quick. I'm going to wash some things up, and then I'll be back out and we'll hang. But it says that Mary immediately sat down at Jesus' feet. And I thought that was pretty cool because what I never realized before reading this before is that like Mary discovered one of the most important things to this beautiful moment and not missing the fullness of what Jesus says about her and what Jesus had to say in this moment is that she brought every part of herself. She didn't change anything about herself. She didn't clean up. She didn't spruce up. She didn't change outfits. She didn't do anything. She came and sat at Jesus' feet just the way she was. And what I think is so important, and what I'm beginning to realize is that there's this aspect of belonging to God fully that can only be discovered when you're willing to be vulnerable in front of Him and bring every part of who you are. Jesus says that, discovering who you really are starts by slowing down and sitting at my feet. But He doesn't say anything about sprucing yourself up before you do it. He just says, bring every part of who you are. And vulnerability is where fully belonging to God starts. It's a willingness to say, you know what? My belonging to God has nothing to do with sprucing myself up, but it's just sitting at the feet of Jesus, all of who I am, and knowing that His love never changes. And there's one author writes about vulnerability before God, and I thought this was so beautiful. She said, our rejection of vulnerability often stems from associating with dark emotions like fear, shame, grief, sadness, and disappointment. Emotions that we don't want to discuss, even when they profoundly affect the way that we live, love, and work. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity into our purpose or a deeper and more meaningful spiritual life, vulnerability is the path that allows us to do so. And so I want to encourage you this morning that a certain part of your belonging is going to be dependent upon how willing you are to be vulnerable before Jesus. And can you experience a portion of belonging to God without doing so? Yeah, you can. But if you really want to soak up the moment, if you really want to be present and just sit at Jesus' feet and get everything that He's willing to offer us and speak into our identity, you're going to have to be willing to bring all of who you are to Him. And I just found it so encouraging that like Mary's moment of vulnerability, this is kind of the last thing I want to point out that I thought was so cool. Mary's moment of vulnerability and the moment that she sat at Jesus' feet and she began to just soak in all of belonging to God in that moment and speak to who she was as a person, it takes place at a house with some of her friends around dinner time. It wasn't in the temple. The temple's great. We love the temple. We love the Sunday experience, and it's awesome. And you should come every Sunday because it's amazing. But what I think is super, super cool about Jesus is his willingness to speak into who we are and our identity. It's not boxed in by four walls of a church. And again, I love Sunday, and it's great. It's amazing. But if I could encourage anybody with this belonging to God, it's like, don't discount the moments around dinner with some people that matter most to you in your life. Because Jesus is there too. And he can speak into who you are through the people that matter most over dinner time. And I think that there is something special about Mary bringing her whole self to dinner. And in our communities at Bridge Church, as we go out of here, like, I think that it's a beautiful moment when we can come to dinner with each other and bring all of who we are, and we can find Jesus there at dinner, and he can begin to say things over us that would speak to who we are. And so, I love the Sunday experience. We get to share here every Sunday, and I'm just encouraged that Jesus' ability isn't limited by being in the temple. That he was willing to speak into Mary and who she was as a person and say that she is enough and that she can bring her whole self and know that Jesus' love for her will never change. And it's in that moment that I dare say that Mary began to acquire a little bit more of who she was. And it started with bringing her whole self and sitting at the feet of Jesus. All right? And so as we begin to wrap this up, there's a couple things that I just want to kind of invite you to think about as we go about this week. I don't know all of you. I don't know all of your paces of living. I don't know what you got going on, but I would dare say it's a lot, just based upon the time that we live in, right? And so, again, I've done this long enough to realize that culture and the world and out into our jobs and our careers, there are plenty of opportunities to perform. And there's this pressure to perform. I did it for 10 years. I was in banking for 10 years, and let me tell you, as long as you had the numbers, you were good. You got the numbers for this month? All right, you're great. And I found myself, and maybe you found yourselves, having conversations around the coffee pot or whatever, and instead of someone asking me how I was, they asked, how were your numbers? And for me, that presented this opportunity and this temptation to associate my identity with the amount of numbers that I could put up. And I did it. I did it for a while. But can I tell you how exhausting it was when that pressure turned into I had to do it every month in order to be worth it or in order to be enough? It was exhausting. And I found myself an anxious mess because suddenly my identity was solely rooted in the amount of numbers that I could put up. I found myself so fearful as a person because if I didn't put up the numbers this month, who's going to leave out of my life? Who's going to cut me out of my life or out of their life? And am I going to be lonely and just become a person that's lonely? And that grip, man, that fear will put on you is so exhausting and fearful. But this morning, I want to invite you guys to maybe lay down the pressure that comes with fast-paced performance. Because again, a side effect to performance is more. Keep doing it. And I think that sometimes when we fall into that, we miss beautiful moments to sit at Jesus' feet at dinner with some people that matter most to us and allow that to speak into our identity. I want to invite you this morning to intentionally just kind of slow down so that you can sit down at dinner with God. And that might not be actual food, or maybe it is, but it could be that you set aside time just to go for a walk. I look at Adam and Eve in the garden. And Jesus, they just went on a walk. What was the reason in going for a walk? To go for a walk. That's it. And so for some of you, maybe this invitation is to go for a walk this week. Go for a walk and allow God to speak into who you are, and just know that you can go on a walk as yourself, not hiding anything, not masking anything, taking all of that off. And God says, you know what? You belong. You're my son. You're my daughter. And I would love nothing more than just go on a walk with you. Why? Because I love you. That's it. And that's kind of my last invitation, is this release of pressure to polish up and to feel as though that you have to tidy yourself up to experience a moment of belonging with God, because it's just not true. Jesus desires all of you. It says in Matthew, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And there's nowhere in that verse that says, but a requirement to that, prerequisite, you got to tidy up a little bit. Get it together, get your kids under control, get your finances in order, make sure that you get it all right, and then, we'll get away and go for a walk. No, he says, bring it all to me. Bring it all. I want nothing more than you just to bring it all. And can I tell you something? There is a peace that passes all understanding. I'm starting to understand what that verse means when it says that peace that passes all understanding, because I can't put words to it. But there's this peace that comes from knowing that you can bring all of your baggage to a loving God, and he doesn't change the way that he looks at you whatsoever. That he just says, all right, let's go on a walk. God, you don't know what I did last night. Doesn't matter. Let's go for a walk. But God, I know that I've asked for forgiveness for this over and over, and I need your help or whatever. And God's like, come on, let's go for a walk. That peace and that realization of knowing that we belong to God will speak to your identity in a way that I promise you've never imagined before. And so as we go back into this song, if you want to stand, stand. If you don't want to, I would just encourage you to take a moment and really focus on belonging to God that only comes from a slow pace of living that is just sitting at Jesus' feet. Just sit at his feet and just have a moment with him where he speaks into who you are, and get rid of this pressure to perform, all right?